we thought it important to bring out so that you could see what a decade's worth of legal work looks like. What has gone into the prosecution of this case in order to resist the efforts of an army of highly paid superstars is demonstrated only partly by what you see behind us. We have tried for a long time to convey a message about the injustice that was done to Bradley Edwards and the injustice that continues to be done to the victims of Epstein's abuse as a consequence of the plea bargain that not only resulted in immunity for Jeffrey Epstein, but handed out get-out-of-jail-free cards to his named and unnamed co-conspirators as well. That injustice still needs to be addressed and will be addressed through the pro bono efforts that Brad Edwards and his co-counsel, Utah law professor and former federal judge Paul Casale, have been involved in for many years, and which my law firm is honored to have been invited to join officially as of this morning when we made our notice of appearance in that federal case. Now, I've said more than enough. I thank you for the opportunity of listening to me, and I will be available to answer questions, but the person I'm sure that you want to hear from is Brad Edwards, my hero.
Is there still disappointment that none of the victims will have, quote unquote, their day in court this week? Because this trial is not happening.
Well, just so that we're very clear about what was going to happen and what was not going to happen, which is something that weighed into all of the decisions that we made, the court made it very clear that he was not going to allow this case to turn into a trial about whether and to what extent Jeffrey Epstein molested dozens of children. It was not going to be about that. It was only going to be on Jeffrey Epstein's assault on me, where he made allegations that I had made up certain of those allegations. And so there might have been 3 victims who would have testified in some very watered down fashion. And everyone looking for the salacious or sordid details would have been grossly disappointed. This would have revealed itself as the distraction that Jeffrey Epstein wanted it to be in reality. Those victims, though, because of the good journalism, and Julie Brown, I want to thank you specifically for really just digging in. Everybody for 10 years has taken snippets of information and tried to make headlines, sometimes right, sometimes wrong, sometimes true, sometimes false. I felt like half the time I was just trying to correct a record. Finally, we had somebody just dig in and get it right. Still the tip of the iceberg, but everything is getting it right. And you know what? I'm now getting calls from my clients who have been hidden, who have been pushed into silence, scared to death, finally saying, one, Brad, thank you for standing up to him and pushing him to the brink till he had to admit, you win, he lost. Thank you. Second, they're willing to talk. They want to share their story. This was part of their healing. This was never about me. I took this case to the end for them, and the focus should go back on them. The focus should never have been on me, and sitting through 2 weeks for me to prove that everything that I've been saying from the beginning of time till now is true, and everything in retaliation that was said by Jeffrey Epstein against me to try to extort me into abandoning my clients, which I refused to do, was false. I didn't need those 2 weeks. You heard it in his own words. What more can I ask for in the fact that I got to do that without needing to draw my clients in to testify and be cross-examined and get beaten up for no reason and suffer and hurt any further? Wasn't fair to them. So what happened today was a win, and it allows me to do what I do. I help people who can't help themselves. That's it. That's what I want to do. the first time that Courtney Wild walked into my office in 2008 and said, look, the government's not paying attention to me, can you make it happen? She was not asking for money from Jeffrey Epstein. She just wanted somebody to pay attention to her. And when I realized that the U.S. Attorney's Office, for whatever reason, was not interested in prosecuting Jeffrey Epstein and was more interested in immunizing Jeffrey Epstein, I filed a lawsuit, a petition for a violation of crime victims' rights. And I walked it into the federal courthouse. At that time, I had never practiced in federal court. All I had was passion. And I walked it in and I handed the pleading in to the lady who was at the desk. Courtney Wild was right outside, ready at the time. She told me, this is an emergency. And I told the clerk, I want a hearing. And she said, when? I said, now. What's going on is wrong. I want it now. And she took it back to her boss and she came back and said, you don't get a hearing now. It doesn't even say emergency on this first pleading. I said, give me that paper back. I hand wrote emergency on it and handed it right back to her. It was an emergency then. Judge Mara treated it like an emergency then. We got right into court after I got laughed at by the clerk. But if you go back to docket entry number 1 on the CVRA case, there's handwritten emergency, and that's how that happened. From that day, we've treated that like an emergency. It's taken a really, really, really long time to get here. But now we're past the sideshow of what was allegations Jeffrey Epstein made against me, that he's now said were categorically false. We can focus now back on the people that we care about and who need our help. That's our clients.
So where do you go now? Where's the pursuit now with the victim?
So step number 1 is we have filed our motion for summary judgment. If anyone is interested, you go to that case, 08-80736. It's docket entry 361. It lays out all the details you need. Judge Mara should rule on this at any moment, and I have a feeling that Mr. Scarola's entry of an appearance in this case, one of the first things that we are going to do is attempt to set a hearing that I bet you before today, we would have had 2 victims attend and scared to do that. And after today, we're going to have a volume of victims that are going to come forward and be ready to testify and not get cross-examined. Testify about what happened to them in a way that'll help them heal.
That'll be in federal court.
That'll be in federal court, yes. And look, who knows what else is going to come out. I mean, the excellent journalism has spread the message. It's not just a state court case that's stuck in Palm Beach County now. People are really aware of what's going on. And there were times where people were aware, but were also scared to do something about it. So everybody's coming forward, and it feels like there's no more fear.
Is it possible for Epstein to just keep settling out of court, keep the information becoming public?
Well, it's not possible for the information not to become public, because the information is becoming very public. And if you really dig into all of the public court filings that I've been filing and Mr. Scarola has been filing for the last 10 years, you can find most of anything that you're looking for, whether he likes it or not. And I'll tell you, for the most part, he does not.
Should Jeffrey Epstein be frightened?
Jeffrey Epstein is not an unintelligent person. It would take a fool not to recognize that he faces extremely serious jeopardy at this point. He faces the distinct possibility that his sweetheart plea bargain can get set aside and that he and others will face federal criminal prosecution. There was a development this morning. I'm not aware of the complete details. It's been reported to me secondhand, but apparently an effort is being made in Congress to open an investigation with regard to the circumstances of how this plea bargain could possibly have been entered into. I've practiced law for over 45 years. The first 5 of those years were spent as a criminal prosecutor. I have never seen, I have never heard of a plea bargain in which not only the prospective defendant, but the defendant's named and unnamed co-conspirators were granted blanket immunity for unnamed crimes. That just doesn't happen. That's inexcusable. There is no reasonable justification, regardless of what kind of evidence Jeffrey Epstein may have been secretly providing to some other prosecuting authority. There is no justification for keeping this deal secret, for violating the Crime Victims' Rights Act that affords victims an opportunity to be able to address the court before any plea bargain is approved by a judge. And there is absolutely no justification for the broad scope of immunity that was granted in this case. That is deserving of the kind of scrutiny that Julie Brown began to focus on this case, and that hopefully the U.S. Congress will focus on this case as well. They can get answers that we can't get. So we're counting on that development as being very significant in terms of being able to ultimately bring Jeffrey Epstein to justice.
Mrs. Frola, can I ask how today's settlement and what your hopes for in terms of, like, there's New York lawsuit and other potential cases that and women that might come forward, what do you think effect if this will have on that, and Mexico, these other areas and other women and other court cases already on the docket in those cases, what do you hope and expect to happen?
This settlement is not going to have a direct impact on any other pending investigation. You will have a direct impact on other pending investigations. Your demanding answers, as you have begun to demand, will make the difference. So while Brad deserves a great deal of credit for his tenacity in having seen this through to conclusion, as he's pointed out, this was a case that focused upon his personal vindication. The case that focuses on the vindication of victims is the Crime Victims' Rights Act case. And you can be absolutely sure that we're not abandoning that effort. That effort is going to be renewed and invigorated by what has happened up to this point in time. The decks have been cleared to enable us to focus our attention on that matter without distraction.
How many new victims have poured post-plea agreement?
Yes, go ahead.
The answer to that is yes, but well before that, when you say step forward, we learned over the years about victims all over the country and in other parts of the world, and talked to them, and they've all been scared. And one of the main reasons they've been scared is because of the way that the media covers or has covered and has labeled specifically Jeffrey Epstein's victims from the very beginning. I don't know if everybody remembers, but back in 2008, the charge they allowed Jeffrey Epstein to plead to was soliciting a minor for prostitution. All of a sudden, if you came forward knowing that you were a 13 or 14-year-old girl who had never engaged in prostitution in your entire life, you were born with that label if you were to stand up. And it's only very recently, as the climate has changed, that I've heard from some of these people that we recognized as witnesses a long time ago and promised them, if you don't want to be involved, I'm not going to get you involved. That's just my promise to you. Not going to do it to you. I've heard from them, and they've said, look, we're really thinking about it now because things have changed. The focus is on the right person, and there's nobody that looks at these circumstances who would ever use some derogatory term to speak about these young women. And some of these young women are very, very, very successful people these days, which is scary to come forward, but also putting them on the verge, on the edge of making that jump, which would also be a big, big step, big advancement in the case.
So more victims are they willing to file new charges that could possibly bring a complaint outside of the plea agreement with Jeffrey Epstein?
Well, the first thing, though, is even if we were to win on the Crime Victims' Rights Act case, which our feeling is we should, if we invalidate that immunity deal, that doesn't mean the U.S. Attorney's Office has to charge him. They could enter into the same deal. It just means that they would have to speak with the victims first and actually afford them rights this time. They have prosecutorial discretion. But the focus of attention on this is going to make it more difficult for the government to want anything but an appropriate prosecution. Okay, that's all that we can do. We can't, let's say new victims come forward. Let's say it's in California. There would still need to be a prosecutor in California that wants to prosecute this case. And everybody can go around asking, why is it that nobody, no U.S. Attorney's Office has ever wanted to prosecute what looks like a very, very strong case against a very powerful political person? I don't have that answer for you, but hopefully somebody here can go get it.
And one of the things that you need to understand as well is the very practical consideration that we are dealing in Florida with a restrictive statute of limitations. It would be very difficult at this point, if not impossible, to bring criminal charges arising out of conduct that occurred more than a decade ago. There are jurisdictions where that problem is not faced, but Florida is a jurisdiction where we face statute of limitations concerns. However, there very well could be the possibility of prosecution at the federal level based upon the illegal plea bargain that was entered into.
Do you think Secretary Acosta should resign?
We have not yet heard the rest of the story with regard to Secretary Acosta. He certainly hasn't spoken. I am hopeful that the congressional investigation that is being spoken of takes place. We will get more of the story at that point in time. I'm not here to call for Secretary Acosta's resignation. I don't know all the facts. I know that the facts that are known demand further answers.
What are the precedents for a non-prosecution agreement like this legally, and are there legal precedents then to undo something like that?
There is no precedent for a non-prosecution agreement like this. I am completely unaware of any non-prosecution agreement extending immunity to unnamed co-conspirators for unidentified crimes. I am entirely unaware of secrecy having been expressly bargained for in violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act. One of the things that encourages us about the possibility of setting aside this plea bargain is that it was indeed Jeffrey Epstein and his dream team of high-powered, high-priced lawyers who insisted upon the secrecy provisions in violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act. That puts Epstein in a position where it becomes difficult, if not impossible, for him to argue, I want to enforce a contract that I required have provisions that were violative of the Crime Victims' Rights Act included in the contract. The contract was illegal from the outset. He knew it was illegal from the outset. It needs to be set aside. We need to start from the beginning with regard to issues with respect to that prosecution.
So then you're saying that the feds, if they decided to file charges, the statute of limitations wouldn't apply?
I am saying that there's a very good argument that no statute of limitations applies with regard to the federal charges.
Kind of compare him to like Harvey Weinstein, and part of the reason perhaps some of these women came forward. Can you just discuss the correlation somewhat?
You want to take that?
Sure. There are some similarities, different age group targeted victims, but there are some similarities. And the most striking is the degree of power. I mean, you saw it first with Cosby, and people thought nobody's going to believe me. This guy is, he's the pudding pop man. And then you have Harvey Weinstein, who's basically running Hollywood, and that's somebody who Jeffrey Epstein knows. Those are people that know one another, and they run in the same circles. And once the victims started coming forward one after another, how many times, even after 5, 6, 7 victims of Harvey Weinstein had come forward, were there still doubters? It wasn't until there were so many that Harvey Weinstein himself just couldn't take on the barrage of complaints that everybody said, you know what, that's right. So the victims here see the same thing. As the numbers increase and as the skepticism decreases and as we have a day like today where Jeffrey Epstein has admitted to wrongdoing, it's only going to increase the confidence of these young women who are now further along in their healing process than they were 10 years ago when we met them. So the chances of this moving in the right direction and having a situation like we had in a courtroom where you saw Larry Nassar and had to face one Olympic gymnast after another, after another, after another, that day should come, and that day will come.
I disagree with Brad with regard to one significant point. These high-profile abusers are not running in the same circles. They are slithering in the same circles. They are crawling in the same circles. And there is no more running because there is no more place to hide.
Thank you
Yes.
for your work.
All right. I appreciate it.
Thank you all so very much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I appreciate you all being here. Jack and I both really appreciate the time and effort all of you have put into just getting to the truth of the matter. Thank you very much.